Okay, so thanks again for being here. Thanks to the University of Naples, L'Orientale, for hosting us, and also to the Center for East Asian Studies that has sponsored the event. It's a great pleasure for me to have a colleague and a friend like Dawid Rogacz. We have met across different conferences across the world, and we share very similar interests because we are both fascinated by the Chinese intellectual history, I would say, and particularly on the interpretations and use of the past that are made both more purely philosophically, but also in a more politically concrete way, I would say. So we are fascinated by theories of historiography, by utopianism, by techniques and interpretations of historiography. And also we are both, I would say, active in comparative kinds of approaches or researches as in the Society for Asian and Comparative Philosophy. So we share this kind of approach. So I was very happy to learn that Dawid had published with Bloomsbury this summer his book, Chinese Philosophy of History. I think it's a very important and valuable contribution to our understanding of Chinese philosophy. And again, also in a comparative sense. I think it's a very interesting reading and important insight for people working on other philosophical traditions who might better understand the relevance of opening their perspectives to the Chinese intellectual world. So as said, we will have two introductory remarks from two of my colleagues and friends from the University of Naples, Professor Chiara Ghidini, who teaches East Asian philosophies and religions here, and Professor Donatella Guida, who teaches Chinese history. So we try to have the both parts of philosophical and historical approach. So please, I would like to ask Chiara Ghidini to give her introductory observations on the book and on the event. And please, Chiara.
Yeah, thank you very much. So I take Federico's intention to keep this talk informal. So I will refer to Dr. Rogacz as Dawid, and I hope he doesn't mind.
Yeah.
So, well, of course, I thank Federico for this opportunity, and I also thank Dawid because this gave me the chance to be more aware, if I needed to, of my limits when it came to knowledge and some kind of epistemological issues. I must say that I realize philosophy of history is a discipline that is quite thriving these days, at least judging from the recent publications, many of which are branded Bloomsbury, so which might be a sign that they are particularly interested in the field. And well, in a book edited by Xuecheng, which I think came out only in 2020, so more or less when Dawid's book came out, there is a very important stress on how philosophy of history can help better understand our time. So philosophy of history applied to the knowledge and the understanding of contemporary issues, which are environmental, are health related. The book came out when COVID pandemic was already on, so I guess there is a liaison there, but also all kinds of upheavals, and God, if we've seen many of them even recently, I mean, in the beginning of 2021. Also, usually there is always an outline of the history of the philosophy of history, and this outline of the history is usually quite conventional. I mean, it's a conventional mapping which stretches through three phases. The first would be the so-called speculative history, philosophy of history. Well, and I mean, of course, Hegel is one of the most prominent. And then there is the analytical philosophy of history with Hempel, but also with Collingwood, which is actually closer to the next phase, which is the one I'm a bit more familiar with, which is probably dated to the 1970s with Hayden White and his idea of meta-history and the concept of imagination. Obviously, well, Hayden White, when we come to Italian historiography, was very much criticized by two great scholars, Arnoldo Momigliano on the one hand and Carlo Ginzburg on the other. But it's also because there is an issue between meta-textuality and extra-textuality. I mean, there are a lot of issues when you deal with narrativism, which is actually the one option of the philosophy of history, which was taken also by Japanese authors. And here I come to another important aspect that I saw in David's book, which is actually to go beyond the conventional history of the philosophy of history, to problematize it, to enrich it, to stress that the mapping is actually much more layered, and to add Polish authors, which I think is a very important step in order to make it richer and not to limit to the very well-known, let's say, agents operating within the very interdisciplinary field of the philosophy of history. And David also, asks about this idea of of meaning in or meaning of history, and has to deal also with the definition of history. I mean, what is history after all? Everybody quotes Bloch, but obviously there is so much more to that. And when it comes to China, even authors like von Ranke are quite important because they did have an impact both on Chinese intellectual history or historiography and on the Japanese one. I'm sorry if I talk sometimes about Japan, but that's actually my main field. So the idea of a philosophy of history regarding China has been dealt with. David quotes, for example, Daniel Little, who actually applied it to modern China or even contemporary China, let's say the Great Cultural Revolution years, so in the 60s. But I do guess that David's is the first comprehensive book on the philosophy of history applied to China. And what is also very interesting is that he, let's say, dwells a lot on the problematic issue of terminology, which, yes, of course, terminology as applied to the Chinese context. So the idea of how to say philosophy of history, I mean, the conventional way, which takes up a term borrowed from Japanese neologism for philosophy. In Japanese, it would be Tetsugaku by Nishiyamane in the late 19th century, but also other ways like the concept of history and so forth. So this is obviously great, but I think that his let's say that his way of dealing with terminology goes far beyond the issue of China or of the Chinese context. And I'm sure that he would talk about the terms historiosophy and on the difficulty when you have the English term history, philosophy of history, and what this entails let's say, in interpretative terms. And I'm going towards the end because I cannot really, I mean, I think we all want to hear David, not me, but also the term holism, because for people dealing with Buddhism, it's a very recurrent term, but I mean, when applied to the philosophy of history, maybe it's good to actually explain it in detail so that one doesn't get too confused. And this actually leads me also to maybe understanding Hegel's interpretation as not necessarily so dissimilar when compared to Chinese philosophy of history. Well, also Hegel was, to Hegel, I mean, the term holistic was actually applied, and Hegel did did talk about China in his lectures on the philosophy of history, and China was the beginning of history, so to speak, whereas Europe would be the end. And when we hear the end of history, of course, we are reminded of Francis Fukuyama, who's also somehow inserted within the philosophers of history, which also means that what is philosophy of history and who are the philosophers of history is really Vico, a philosopher of history, is Desserteau, a philosopher of history. So, there is a very huge debate on who belongs to the field, willingly or otherwise. He knows probably, because Federico usually tells more than he should, that eventually we will have to talk about some venerable absences, which are not absent by mistake or by chance, but actually by design. But this I will leave for the discussion, and I will leave the floor to Donatella, Professor Guida, who is actually the expert in Chinese history. Thank you.
Thank you, David, for coming, if I can use this word, in this situation. Thanks to Federico also to have introduced your book to us. And I would like to start with a quotation from Oscar Wilde. This is such a brilliant work. I wish I wrote it, because it's really the long-awaited comprehensive essay about Chinese philosophy of history that we were waiting. And so it was really interesting for me to read it, and I think I will read it over and over again. The crucial point in a Confucian's perspective is the definition that you make very clearly in the beginning, explaining that this term philosophy of history includes both philosophy of the historical process and philosophy of historiography. And this distinction is very important for any student of history, but even more so for Chinese context, because as I hope my students know, there is a gap between what is the so-called reality and what is the perception or the description of it. And every Chinese historiographer has to follow certain rules, because the aim of history is to unravel and to show that virtue has to prevail and the mandate of heaven must be accomplished. So history is the field, both in time and in space, where philosophy can prove itself. And no historiography can be done without a proper interpretation. So we can say in this what you call the holistic vision that history is where the Tao itself can be seen, can be followed. So this holistic vision unites both Taoism and Confucianism, and so we can see the intertwine of both schools. This effort to follow this display of the Tao reminds me more of anything else of Sima Qian's effort to build up this sort of Zhongshu, this comprehensive history that goes down from the Yellow Emperor to his times. And of course, he's just trying to understand what kind of meaning has human history, because of course Chinese history identifies with human history itself. and also the meaning of his single life. And I appreciated very much in David's work the fact that he starts from the text. That is what we would call the Xuecheng approach, according to the Qing Times definition. And this is very important, and to me is also very effective, because it starts from the text itself, and it follows the evolution or simply the process from the early period, the early thinkers, up to the High Qing times. And I found also very remarkable that he chose to finish his work with Zhang Xuecheng. That is a very interesting final point. Zhang Xuecheng was an historian who lived in Qing times in the beginning of 18th century. And I would like to thank David for his effort to highlight the importance of this period that has been so often sort of neglected, because usually the 18th century, the 19th century thinkers are considered the beginning of so-called modernity. And actually, we can see through Zhang Xuecheng and through other thinkers that lived also in the transition between Ming and Qing times, we can see that actually there was much more before that. And finally, I would like also to underline that it's important what you wrote about the fake idea of European scholars like Karl Lowitt that you quoted, that believed that philosophy of history itself was actually invented, so to say, in the West, from Hegel and to the other that followed him. And actually it is not, because as you show very effectively, we have a philosophy of history from Confucius, maybe earlier. So we have to, the effort of us, like as Orientalists or Sinologists or Yamatologists or whatever, is also encompasses also this task to show things in the right perspective. So it's not like everything has been too much Eurocentric, or at least it is to the mainstream culture. So this is another stronghold of your book. I have some questions for you, but I will leave to the discussion, and so now I think it's time for you to speak. Thank you.
So thank you, Professor Ghidini, thank you, Professor Guida. And now we can start our actual conversation. So my role, as I said, would be very limited. I will just interview David, basically. So I would start following up on what my colleagues have both observed. For a long time, we have been said in the West that China had no philosophy at all. And now you tell us that China has a philosophy, and has a philosophy of history even. So my first question is exactly about this aspect. So your use of, first of all, of philosophy as something that you give it for granted. I mean, we can apply to the Chinese context. We are both active also in the European Association for Chinese Philosophy, and I'm very happy that among our guests here we have Jana Roschke, who was the founder of the association. So we both give for granted that we can use the term philosophy when talking about China, but this is something that has been debated for such a long time, right? And more specifically, philosophy of history. So I would like you to tell us something more about your choice of the terms, what you mean when you talk about philosophy of history, and also making reference to some other terms that you use, especially in the introductory part, and then also in the conclusion of your book. Historica, historiosophy, philosophy of historiography. So what kind of differences do we have among these terms, and how can we use them in the Chinese context?
Thank you. First of all, I'd like to thank you for the invitation of the University degli Studi di Napoli Orientale, which is, as I guess, the oldest, right, school of Asian and Chinese studies in Europe. And I really wish I could have been in Naples now because it's snowing in Western Poland. There are no polar bears in Poland. At least they are not walking freely on the streets, but it's snowing. Yeah, the question, this is the question of an utmost importance for my work. And actually, I spent most of my discussions with my colleagues during many conferences when and where I told them about the project I'm working on, about the very issue of methodology, theoretical assumptions, and terminology. So yes, I pled guilty. I take philosophy as applied to China as something granted, most of all because I don't see where the reverse assumption would have led us to. And just as, for instance, Brian Van Norden, I generally perceive philosophy as intercultural phenomenon that is some sort of umbrella term for various ways of theoretical reflection upon the meaning of human life, in being, in this context, history, and the fact that the term was invented in Greece doesn't mean that Indian Brahmanas, darshanas as schools, and the same, all the more with Chinese Jia did not deal with philosophy. This is something I discussed in other parts of my work, but let's say I take it for granted on pragmatic grounds. Philosophy of history is a little bit more problematic, and of course it always entails a question almost automatically, especially when we talk to philologists, whether there was a term, philosophy of history. So of course we can answer with a joke that since there is no word tree in Chinese, there certainly are no trees in China, but of course the issue is more important. It is the case that the term for a certain sphere of reflection, let's say aesthetics, ontology, epistemology, in my opinion, comes to life usually along with maturation, if not conclusion of a certain tradition. The term aesthetics was found in 18th century Europe as applied to the philosophical theory of art and their values. The same concerns the term ontology, which was invented by Christian Wolff. But no one would say that Plato did not develop any ontology. And in terms of philosophy of history, the Chinese have their own understanding of philosophy, which is based not so much on the love of wisdom as search for the principle, Qun Li Zhi Xue. And what is important, I did not mention that in the English book, but it is mentioned in the Polish version of that book, that in the Chinese translation and commentary to Aristotle's Categories, Ming Li Han, from 1631, Li Zhizhao, Chinese Christian neophyte, writes explicitly that the Greek term philosophia is exactly the same what Chinese have in mind while speaking of Qunli Zhixue, that is a learning or doctrines that seek the principle, the general principle of things. So this is a nice argument that even Chinese themselves considered these two terms as somehow denoting pretty much the same similar, let's say, more safer areas of reflection, and the same regards history. But as I insist, there are two terms for history in the classical vocabulary of Chinese philosophers. The one is Gujin, which is created in the same manner as the modern terms such as Daxiao for size or Zuoyou, Dongxi, namely by combining two opposites. And when the historians of China, the philosophers, are writing about Hao Gujin, they are writing about exactly examining history. And we have, of course, the other sense, which is shi, that originally denoted an office of an astrologer, scribe, fortune teller. With time, it started to refer to the official scribe, let's say historian, and then it started to be used with regard to particular historical works. So there is also in Chinese reflected this ambiguity that was marked by Chiara with regard to the modern Western notion of history. Or I guess in Italian, it's pretty much the same with storia, that it can relate to both histories as histories about history. In Latin, we have a strong demarcation between history as res geste and historia rerum gestarum, and it somehow vanished in most of the languages. Not so much in German, when where we still have some sort of distinction. Maybe it's not so strict between Historie and Geschichte, and it is still present in Polish. Between historia and dzieje for what is going on, simply what was going on in the past, the Geschichte, almost literally. So Chinese had this ambiguity preserved, and they reflected upon it. And my idea was to, of course, look for the philosophy of history, but I was well aware of the fact that I have to be enough open-minded, let's say tolerant, because nowadays, again, Chiara pointed that out, philosophers of history are somehow divided into camps, especially the analytical philosophers of history and their inheritors, such as the narrativists, have this tendency to view their, let's say, continental counterpart, but it's not so strictly geographical, as I point out in the book, as metaphysical, even theological, so that any way of philosophizing about history as a process is religious in its core, which is, I think, maybe not absurd, but it's not as well grounded as they presuppose. And on the other hand, of course, the classical continental philosophers of history, or I don't know, thinkers like Benjamin and others, would have this tendency to viewing the analytical part as merely theory of history, some sort of part of historical studies, purely academic endeavor that has no importance, no relevance whatsoever to history, understood as a process we are part of, especially nowadays in the phase of pandemic. We once again feel the history, that there is some history going on, or the last events on the Capitol and so on. We feel the history once again. So we also feel that this analytical presumption that all we can do is to have a look at the narratives, and even from a certain viewpoint, the logical or methodological or purely literally one, is not enough. And I tried, especially with regard to pre-modern tradition of Chinese reflection, to be open enough to acknowledge and include both philosophy of historiography and speculative philosophy of history within the very general notion of the philosophy of history as such. And I don't tend to believe, especially based on the overview of the survey of these 40-some thinkers, that a speculative philosopher of history necessarily subscribes to or supports the idea of the logic of history. This is a very narrow and strong version of the philosophy of historical process. We can, for instance, believe that history is freely created by individuals without any constraints of, say, geographical, economical, and social mechanisms. And we are, willingly or not, philosophers of history in this sense. But we are not presuming any logic of history. So there's also a very strong, I would say, not only assumption, but also misunderstanding that the people who want to do something more than philosophize about historical works are almost automatically Hegelians or Hegelian-like metaphysicians slash theologians. And this is what I try to prove, partially based on the Chinese material. And historiosophy, I tried to look for the term that would help me with making a transition from the earliest sources to the philosophical schools or general thinkers of the Warring States period, because I'm aware of the fact that you cannot just say, okay, so here are the bronzes, inscriptions on the bronzes, this is philosophy of history. That would somehow compromise my main enterprise, so to speak, or my main project. There are only scarce remarks, or if you have historical narrative that only implies some view of history, or works of art like the Book of Songs that contain some view of history therein, but do not elaborate on that, we cannot just then say, okay, so this is also philosophy of history, because in this case, we are making this term somehow meaningless. If it can be applied everywhere, it is useless. So I tried to find a term, and historiosophy come to the fore. It was a term coined by Cieszkowski, who was a disciple of Hegel, and I used the term in other way that he employed it, but basically historiosophy as a term that was also used, for instance, by Gershom Scholem with regard to the historiosophy of Jewish Kabbalah, is denoting all the views that are implicitly hidden in historical works, literary works, works of art, or even more specifically, that refers to the views of history that are implied by these works and not so much contained or even more elaborated within them. So in this case, after the earliest historiosophy of the bronze inscriptions, the Book of Documents, the Book of Songs, we also have some later instances of historiosophy, for instance, in the mentioned Sima Qian, Sima Guang, generally historians of China. They were not philosophers, at least not in the totality of their works. There are also philosophical parts of their works I point out to. But for instance, when you read Sima Qian's narrative of Xiangyu, or actually 2 or 3 of them, you cannot really say that this is a philosophical work or philosophical essay, treatise on the role of individuals in history or the agency of heaven. But you clearly see by the way Sima Qian is narrating these events, the statements he's putting into the mouths of these interlocutors, which are different depending upon the part of the Shiji, that there is some historiosophy going on there. And this is the way I understood this term. I hope that maybe, because this term is really not so much used elsewhere at all, I really hope that it could work outside the context of China, because in the same manner we have Greek, Roman historiosophy, we have historiosophy of, for instance, Italian Neoplatonic thinkers like Ficino and others, where you cannot really say that they were philosophers of history, like purebred philosophers of history as Hegel or Marx. But there is certainly some sort of view of history that is absorbed within their commentaries or religious thought. So that would be my idea of the term historiosophy, with relation to the philosophy of history and all the other controversies.
Okay, thank you. As anticipated at the beginning, we have decided to distribute the Q&A session after each answer. So it's easier also because the topic is so vast that we risk losing track. So if there are questions at this point on this specific aspect of the book, please raise your hand and I will moderate. Okay, so if there are no questions at this point, this means that your answer was very clear and has left no room for any doubt. Great. So I'm now moving to the second topic that I'm sure will give us more space for discussion. We are now, I would like to look at some specific Chinese aspects. So we have talked about this general methodological and terminological problem. But in your book, there is a passage within what you call Chinese philosophy of history that is absolutely pivotal, I would say. And it's the elaboration of the famous theory of the Tianming, the heavenly mandate, that our students also know pretty well, I hope. And so my question would be your personal interpretation of the relevance of this Tianming theory within the history of Chinese philosophy of history. And also two aspects in particular, the role of dynasties and the sequence of dynasties and of different political powers, political actors within this theory, but also the connection between this theory of the Tianming and what you maybe not explicitly, but somehow implicitly define as a cliche that we have about Chinese history, which is that Chinese history is cyclical. So we have this cliche that the Chinese view of time is cyclical, the Western modern view is linear, and the linear interpretations of time within Chinese intellectual history are just a minor part of it, are marginal until the encounter with modernity, but you have a different opinion about that, and this also reflects in your interpretation of Tianming. So my question is about Tianming in your view.
Yeah, okay, so that actually splits into two separate issues, two separate questions. The first one is concerning the mandate of heaven, or whatever we like to translate Tianming, and then the very important issue of the cyclical views of history developed within pre-modern China. Starting with the Tianming. So you asked a very interesting question about the importance, in my own opinion, of this doctrine. So I would say that, of course, from the viewpoint of Chinese history, and the way the concept was used ideologically by the emperors of given dynasties, and all the more by the rulers that aspired to be an emperor or to found a dynasty during these periods of breakup, like southern and northern dynasties. It was extremely important, and you cannot really grasp the essence, at least, of Chinese history without having an insight into this concept. But with regard to the philosophy of history, I have an impression, and it is somehow confirmed when you have a look at the development of the ideas through the prism of my book, that after the theory somehow crystallized in its understanding, I don't want to say that it became almost automatically a doctrine, but when you observe its development from, let's say, even bronze inscriptions up to Zhongshu, then you see that after that it is much more taken as a given and either accepted, slightly reinterpreted, or contested than actually developed in an original philosophical way. And so the question about the doctrine of Tianming, or the concept of Tianming, is extremely important, especially for this warring states and early Han part. Generally, everything that happened before the common era, to use the Western nomenclature. So it happens to be that Tianming or Tianling, Mingling, and all the connections that I observe in the book somehow are the earliest attempts at philosophizing about history in China, as you can observe in these bronze inscriptions, in the Book of Songs, and so on. And this constitutes a kernel of early Chinese historiography without any doubt. And the Book of Documents, of course, we have problems, a very big problems with the reliability of the Book of Documents. But the Book of Documents, if we assume that at least some of the Zhongshu, some its part, is early, say, pre-Confucius, then this book has to convey already a very developed version of the theory of the mandate of heaven. And what I would like to stress here is, because you're asking about my view of the theory of the mandate of heaven, is that it was almost always approached as a political theory, as a Chinese version of the concept of divine rights, right? Like all the Western kings were saying, by the grace of God, I, Elizabeth II, or something like that. And there was nothing special, right? Ideological, or as Slavoj Žižek would say, greetings to Jana, pure ideology, right? But what fascinated me with Tianming the most is that it has some almost logical, or at least formal structure of a reflection upon the historical process as such. So, for instance, I observed that already in the Book of Documents, you can see that there are conditions that all these dynasties receiving or appointed by heaven and being withdrawn with a mandate have to fulfill. So the mandate is exclusive. Only one dynasty at a time can have a mandate, right? The mandate is not empty. there cannot be a situation when no dynasty does not have a mandate. There could be a period of chaos, but for instance, a peasant Liu Bang has been already appointed by heaven, although people are yet not aware of that fact. He will show to them, manifest as one that was chosen. And finally, the mandate is tentative. No dynasty can really have the mandate back, despite the fact that we have all these later dynasties like Hosung and so on. But the Zhou cannot really have the mandate back. The same with the Han and all other dynasties. So this already had at that time some sort of inner structure that of course implies the cyclical view, but what is important, the cycles from the very beginning are somehow inscribed into the superior line, usually of retrogression or a fall, sometimes of more progressively directed line. But I will just return to that issue after a few minutes, that it is really hard to find in China purely cyclical approaches. I just like to mention that, and I'll come back to that issue in a second. But coming back to the Tianming, so we have the Book of Documents, which of course has its political function without any doubt. All the more that there are speeches there, and we really cannot believe that they were reliably recorded after centuries, right? But nonetheless, we have the view that the mandate is based on or endowed due to the moral capacities of the ruler, and more specifically due to the condition, and this is important, social, economical, what sort of condition, moral condition of the people. Mencius basically added to this idea, because he fully supported it, in contrast to Xunzi and importantly Confucius, he added that people have a moral right to disobey the ruler that has lost his mandate, who acts as a particular person and not as a ruler anymore. And then I would say that the first stage is, of course, the Han theory of correlation and generally Zhongshu, or the whole Gumiang commentary tradition that after Zhouyan especially connected this with a theory that also natural disasters, or more specifically some sort of breakthroughs or unexpected, how to say, skipping the stages of history within the strict scheme of natural processes, like the succession of wuxing of 5 phases, or the succession of yin-yang forces is being made, as in the case of the Qin dynasty. So in this sense, we have finally a conglomerate we know as the theory of the mandate of heaven, where both, or not only both, social, moral, and natural omens or signs are somehow telling us that a mandate of heaven has been either appointed, given, or withdrawn. And in this sense, of course, this theory is very holistic, and it also somehow tries to struggles, I would say, with finding a connection or a continuous transition from the agency of individuals, mostly rulers, and the collective agency of the people. And this is also very important for the later philosophy of history that won't be so much interested in the fear of Tianming itself, but will be very interested in the issue of historical influence of individuals, their freedom, and the role of some sort of impersonal tendencies within history. So this is the Tianming idea. I really oversimplified it, but I'm still looking at the clock, so I want to come back to the topic of cyclical views of history. I know that was cruel, but I hope I will cast all the doubts out in the discussion. So cyclical views of history, as I said, cyclical views of history that would be purely cyclical are hard to find. Actually, I conclude that only 3 philosophers held purely cyclical views of history. It was Zhouyan, the founder or the main representative of the Yin-Yang school, who accepted the existence of natural cycles, Zhongshu, a later Han philosopher who argued for the existence of political cycles, and finally Shaoyong, who was deeply inspired by Buddhism and who advocated probably the most consistent and speculative version of the cyclical view of history at all. And we can say that he somehow constructed the metaphysical cycles, the cycles of the universe as such, that are impersonally cognizable due to the recognition of some mathematical and numerological schemes. I can develop that issue in a second. But what is important is that in most cases, these cycles are inscribed into the superior line of either retrogression or fall or progress. With this progress is understood in a very specific way. So from the Book of Documents, Mencius, and all these Han era thinkers, up to the brothers Zhang and Zhu, we'll find this idea, especially the Zhang brothers. I stress that they believe that the cycles are present within each cycle as, in a matryoshka way. There is a cycle of a day and a cycle of an hour and so on. But nonetheless, all these cycles are consecutively inscribed into the line of a fall or of a decline of a moral principle, which happens to be the principle of history in some moral metaphysical sense. And Zhu also believed that the matter itself, if we allow for translating qi in such a way, is also falling, is also retrogressively degenerated. So we see that the most characteristic part of this Confucian view was not so much purely cyclical. But then we also have philosophers that were not so much interested in the theory of Tianming, or even totally contested the fact that Tian is some sort of supernatural actor that is equipped with historical agency, that Tian maybe just denotes heaven, like sky, as a celestial being, a material thing. But they also try to connect these linear and cyclical themes, and these are the theories of the shi, of the tendency of history, mostly Chen Liang, Wang Tingshan, Zhang Juzheng, Li Zhi, and Wang Fuzhi. They also saw some sort of cycles, or I would say rather phases of the development of this linear tendency of history that have to be recognized. So we can live at certain stage of a cycle, but nonetheless we have a line that is present within the structure that unfolds, and the prominent individuals are somehow capable of seeing this before all other people, and in a limited way, of course, foreseeing the future unfolding of this tendency. So in this way, the cycles were a mediation between the linearity of inner structure of process of each of its stages and the superior tendency of the history of China and the world. Because it is noteworthy that Chen Liang distinguished the tendency of history of China from Tianxia zhi or Tianxia zhi Tonggu Jin zhi shi. So we have this idea of a tendency of the world, which is somehow only just left there without any comment. What does it mean that there is a separate tendency of Tianxia and of Zhongguo? But what is really important is that we have many purely linear approaches to history that were developed on the Chinese soil, and I just have a look at the conclusion in my book. So I just mentioned them if someone still doubt that there are linear views of history. So the vision of Dathong, the Moists, the legalists, Lu Jia, He Xiu, Huan Tan, the authors of the Huainanzi, the Taiping Jin, Han Yu, Wang Ganshi, Liu Zongyuan, Li Gou. These are all the thinkers that represented purely linear approaches to history. Some of them distinguished some phases, stages of this process. Some of them just supported the, let's say, undifferentiated linearity of history. And what I would like to stress is that in the philosophy of history, or even more in the history of philosophy of history, there is often some sort of mixture, or even I would say a overlapping of the notion of a stage of history and the cycle. So basically, the cycle means for me that we are returning to the beginning. The fact that we doubt nowadays that such cycles exist doesn't mean the fact that in pre-modern times, most of cultures somehow represented in majority or minority, but generally came up with this idea of the cycles of history, which were modeled upon the cycles of nature, the succession of the 4 seasons. But the stages is something different. We can have, let's say, the Moist division of history that divides history into 4 stages. So we have the initial stage of war, then we have this ideal period of the sages who were inspired by this ideal of impartial care, Jian'ai. Then we have again another period of disorder, and Moists have a hope, have a wish that there will be again another epoch of impartial care, of universal love in the future. But this is not a cyclical way of understanding historical process, because each of these stages is different and they are all irreversible. We cannot return to the initial disorder, just as we cannot really restore the period of the sages. Simply, we have to reinvent the way they dealt with things, but we cannot simply come back to their particular solutions. And that's also the thing that many other critics of the idea of the welfare system and return to antiquity had in mind in China. So the cycles mean that we really can turn back the clock, that we start from the beginning. So for instance, Shaoyong, he divided history into epochs, then constituting revolution, and so we have era and era of eras that amounts to, how was it, 16 billion something years. And after the era of eras, the world is destroyed and begins anew. And there is no question of the differences or the some sort of implicit linearity between the stages, the cyclical stages of history. We're really starting once again. So I would also be careful with using the word cycle at all with regard to the philosophies, the speculative philosophies of history. And if we have that in mind, we'll realize that there were only 3 purely cyclical philosophers of history in China. So I would agree with Federico that this is a cliche, but what we can do as sinologists or philosophically oriented sinologists is to destroy that stereotype after a careful study of respective philosophies of history. Since we have that in hand, we can just show to the people. It's really dangerous to be involved in some sort of abstract discussions. Donatella mentioned Levitt. So all these arguments are very abstract in their nature. They presume, for instance, that philosophy of history, first, this is one premise, is a successor of the theology of history, most importantly that of the St. Augustine. So since we don't have Christianity in China, we don't have philosophy of history in China, voila. Very simple, right? All the people in the room are convinced. But if we are involved in this sort of argumentation, we can be really defeated. So we have to adopt another argumentation, which is very exhaustive. It was. But it is a little bit more inductive, let's say bottom top, rather than other way around. And if we have these concepts, then we can really show that all these ideas were very sophisticated, complicated, and it was very, very hard to me, honestly, to find, after all, despite the declaration in the introduction, common denominator of these views of history. So that the title is Chinese Philosophy of History, but there is no such a thing as one Chinese philosophy of history. The title should go in plural, right? So this was said by the author. And I really think that we have to think of Chinese philosophies of history in the same way as we think of Western philosophies of history and all other philosophies. There are currents, thinkers, maybe not schools, but camps, no matter. We have really different wings and circles of allies and enemies, polemists and supporters. And we only have some sort of umbrella term like philosophy of history that serves us for pragmatic purposes to delineate or, let's say, shed a light on some under-investigated, under-examined, under-explored area of Chinese thought, but nothing more, right? So I also hope that would be my last word regarding this question. Sorry for it took so long, that I really also don't believe that there is one single Chinese philosophy of history at all. This tradition was extremely sophisticated, internally diversified, and ambiguous.
Thank you, David. Yes, you're right. We still have to fight in the 21st century with this essentialism, right, of which is a problem for every culture, but even more so for us who work on Chinese culture in maybe, as it's our case, mostly in the so-called West. So we have to strive to demonstrate there is no such thing as the Chinese essence, the Chinese thought, that somehow predetermines how China will develop, because this is something that we consider ridiculous when thinking about our own cultures, right? We give it for granted again that within the Italian, the German, the French culture, the British culture, you have different positions, you have debates, you have equally strong proposals and ideas. And when we look at the Chinese side, we struggle with this. We must also say that this is a problem that derives from the Chinese culture itself, that has praised the cult of unity also in terms of presenting some kind of unified ideology from China to the rest of the world. And this is something that we still see today. So we should blame both the Eurocentrism, but also the image that the Chinese culture itself has tried to give, this praise for the fact that, you know, when you see the not the press conference, there is no such thing, but when the Communist Party of China communicates their decision, you just see the unanimity, and you know nothing about the debate that happened behind the scene. And we imagine that, of course, there were debates because we see the results very often, reading about people arrested, and we imagine that this is the result of some kind of internal struggle, but it is not communicated that way. And so I think this is also part of a way of communicating difference that is not favoring a deep look at the internal fractures within the debate. So I think it's even more difficult for us to show the diversity of Chinese thought for a number of reasons. And you are right in pointing this. So, and I think that a kind of approach as yours, that a survey that is vast enough to cover centuries, but also focus on a specific aspect, shows the richness and the diversity of Chinese thought. Any questions? Please.
I actually have a remark and a question. The remark concerns the possess of the mandate. You said that the mandate can be possessed by one dynasty or one person at a time. But I was thinking about some periods where the mandate was actually shared. For example, the Three Kingdoms, Sangguo, or you mentioned Juxi. I think Juxi wrote expressly that in his times, Southern Song times, the mandate was actually shared by the different dynasties that ruled over Chinese territory. So there are some exceptions. There are some ways that actually demonstrate what you said, that there is no cyclical, there's nothing can go back to the beginning. And the question regards Wang Fuzhi that you mentioned, because this was also my original plan to ask.
Oh.
I think we have lost Donatella
in the middle of the question.
On the cliffhanger. She was about to ask a question on Wang Fuzhi, and we have lost her. So let's wait if she returns in this time, or in the meantime, someone has something else to ask. Yes, Jana wanted to ask a question. We can't hear you, Jana. You have to unmute.
Okay. Sorry. First of all, I would like to congratulate you once again on this on the publication of this important book, which I really think that it is significant. Yeah. Donatella came back.
Yes, now. Donatella came back.
Shall we first let her finish?
Okay, so she can finish her question and then we go back to Jana.
Yeah. Sorry, my connection has been pretty weird since this morning. So I was asking about Wang Fuzhi. That was originally was in my mind to ask you about, because I love Ming-Qing transition, and I would like to ask you to expand about Wang Fuzhi, especially about this issue of the mandate, because if I'm not mistaken, Wang Fuzhi said clearly that the Qing actually did not possess the mandate. It was not possible. So actually the mandate, it was like rubbish. You know, he came to say that the mandate had never existed. So I would like to ask you to say a bit about this. Thank you.
Thank you. So the first question, I agree with you. I just said that in the book of documents, in this classical formulation that was then supported by Mencius and Zhongshu, it was supposed so that at the time there is one dynasty that holds the mandate. The post-Han era, the Three Kingdoms, and all the time of chaos when we have conquering, competing northern and southern dynasties, it's a time when even three sometimes dynasties at the time just claim that they have the mandate. Of course, the situation of Jushi was different because we have the southern Song, and it was also touched on by Chenliang, who was much more, let's say, intolerant towards the Georgians than Jushi was. But I do not recall an exact passage that says so about the Tianming, that it can be divided by two countries, but I'll have to look for it. Thank you for that. But that doesn't necessarily seems to be in contradiction with the thought of Jushi, because he was not concentrated on that issue. In fact, it seems that he just accepted some sort of the popular elaboration, exposition of the theory of the mandate of heaven, but he was much more interested in the way the principle is manifested in history, and he did not focus so much on the notion of some quasi-personal actors such as heaven. He had a tendency towards equating the Li with Dao of history, but still the principle is somehow the superior notion of his thought, as was of the Chen brothers. But the most cases when Jushi in his writings in the philosophy of history used the term Tian was Tian Li again. So I would say that Jushi, who believed that the principle is one but the manifestations are many, would have said that there could be various mandates of heaven throughout the world, mandate of heaven of the Khitans and so on. But there still be one principle that is manifested in these ways of ordering the state and the people. That would be Jushi-like mode of thinking of the mandate of heaven in this sense. It was definitely not an inclusive one, especially because the manifestations, the Shu from this motto, Li Yifen Shu, are connected with the matter. And the matter is what people are constituted of, and the matter is also changing historically. So when Jushi thought of different nations, cultures, he was mostly thinking of the matter. It is not a coincidence that the Jushi used the term Wenqi in his writings. Of course, we can translate it into some sort of temperament and so on. But it is instructive that in these writings, he also wrote that Wenqi is degenerating throughout time. So he had this tendency of thinking of cultures or if we can translate Wen in this way, because it denoted their customs and morality and so on, moralities, not the Dao De of Juxi, of course, as somehow connected strictly with the geographical, social, and generally material conditions of the people living in respective nations. And I wrote that paradoxically, Juxi somehow anticipated Wang Fuzhi in that matter, that he thought of matter and all the material environment as changing historically. But he insisted essentialistically that there is still some immutable presence or immutable principle of history that is manifested in these various material manifestations. So I didn't know that passage, but that not surprise me. That is a very good question. And Wang Fuzhi, yes, Wang Fuzhi did not use the concept of Tianmin. He was very skeptical towards it, but as I insist, he found a very peculiar place for Tian nonetheless in his philosophy of history, which is often presumed or taken for granted that Wang Fuzhi was totally not interested or denied the existence of heaven and so on, which is not true, especially if we have a look at his Duthungjianwen and Sungluen, which are the most important works for us for reconstructing his philosophy of history. So Wang Fuzhi not only did employ the concept of heaven, but he also distinguished heaven as it is, or heaven in itself, Tianzhi from heaven as it is known by men, Zhenji. And by this distinction, by distinguishing these two maybe aspects of heaven, we should say, he pointed out that there is some sort of directly unrecognized, mysterious presence of heaven in history. So as he wrote that in a passage that uses exactly the same formulation as was used in the Book of Documents, namely Tian Jia Qi Shou, which means that heaven as if use the hands of. This is the exact formulation that occurs in the Book of Documents in the sense of Kantian als ob, was present in the writings of Wang Fuzhi when he wrote that heaven used the interest of Qin Shi Huangdi, of China's first emperor, his Si, in an incomprehensible and mysterious way. We have a character Shen there, the same Shen that means spirit, in order to accomplish something general, Gung, in history. So it of course reminds us of the Hegelian List der Vernunft, but I agree with Julien that we have to have in back of our minds that there is no purpose or end of history there. This is not some sort of use of persons in order to achieve goals. It is simply the way this mysterious, directly unrecognizable aspect of heaven is present in history. And the same words are used regarding the Empress Wu Zetian, the victory of the founders of the Zhou, also the extermination of the Qin, Sui, and Mongol dynasties. So it is really remarkable that on the one hand, Wang Fuzhi was skeptical towards the theory of the mandate of heaven and the very compound Tianmin, but not because he did not believe in the agency of heaven whatsoever, but because he did not believe that it could be foretold in such an easy way. Oh, the dynasty has fallen, so now we know that there would be another dynasty, or that that this dynasty would be a dynasty of water or fire or earth. We don't have any guidebook, a ready-made instruction of saying what will come next. What we can say and have only is our way of investigating the unfolding of the Shi of history. And what we can say from our observation of the Shi of history is that we cannot explain all the history merely by relating to this tendency. There is some sort of irrationality of history we really cannot understand. It's like, sorry for that journey, but if Wang Fuzhi was born today, he would say, we really cannot explain Trump. We cannot explain it. But maybe this is the way heaven used his hands and hair to conduct something general in history. That would be something like that. So Tianmin, as I stressed, has from the very beginning this very rationalistic component, that we have a ready-made structure, that this is exclusive, blah, 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 which means that even if we have exceptions from the rule, the rulers themselves are given with a set of rules that they can use, of course, in an ideological way, but the people know, okay, so that finished, that ended, that will come next. From a political and social viewpoint, which interests Federico the most, this means that nothing really anew could happen. Certainly, a revolution is not possible under such an idea of a ready-made, finite set of rules governing the historical process. But Wang Fuzhi, who witnessed the fall of the Ming, which I think to some extent was a surprise, of course a shock, but a surprise to these Chinese, have this feeling that we really cannot understand everything within history. And that's where heaven come to his mind, but not as a Tianmin, just as heaven, as a weird, I would say, to some extent, even God, in a very weak sense of this term, some sort of metaphysical agent that intervenes in history on his, we don't know, its own will.
Thank you so much.
Jana, please. You started asking a question earlier. And your mic is still off.
Let's forget it. Okay, I also have one short proposal only, and then a question which also regards Tianming. Well, my proposal is, I was thinking when you were talking about this cyclic view of Chinese history, and of course I fully agree with you that this view of cyclic Chinese history is a Eurocentric one, and it is not only a cliche, it is a prejudice, and a very dangerous prejudice, because it can be easily connected to this whole idea of the innate conservatism of the Chinese culture or thought or history. But on the other hand, of course, this linear view of history is also very highly problematic in my view, because history is still, it has to be viewed as some kind of correlation, you know, between repetition and progress, and between continuity and change. Mm-hmm. And so I was thinking about, wouldn't it be a better schema to think about these historical developments in terms of spirals? Yeah. Not linear and not cyclic. Okay, this was only my proposal, thought I had when I was listening to your presentation. But my question also relates this Tianming. I would really like to know, because I saw you have also studied a lot of contemporary Chinese sources regarding the philosophy of history. And first of all, I would like to know how the contemporary Chinese scholars interpret this traditional concept. Do they just decline it as a kind of superstition, or is it a tool that cannot be used anymore? Because I think that also in a theoretical way, it is important, this Tianming concept, because it is one of the main elements that define the holistic nature of Chinese history and historiography. You know, because all the political measurements or all the rulership is connected somehow, or can be expressed through cosmic events and vice versa. So in a theoretical fashion, this is highly, I think, interesting idea or concept. So I would like to know what the contemporary Chinese scholars think about it, this issue, and also if they connect it to any way with the nowadays highly fashionable ideology of Tianxia that was brought about by Zhao Dingyang.
Yeah. Okay. Thank you for the remark and the question. Regarding the remark, I agree with you, and I think I use that term, but even then, in addition to the spiral views of history, there are purely linear views of history in China nonetheless. For instance, that of Xuecheng, Xuxi's father, who believed that there is just a tendency of historical development, this shi, the crucial term, and that it simply unfolds, and that it is very durable, as in the case of the development and the fall of the Fengjian system, feudalism, classical Chinese feudalism. So it takes millennia, and the people could somehow recognize that and maybe stop it or postpone it for a little, but generally this is necessary, unavoidable, and so on. And he does not distinguish any stages, all the more cycles. He strictly criticizes an idea of a return to the earlier phases of the development of this shi. For instance, to the people that were advocating in the Song, as we know, the idea of the return to the welfare system, he says that not only we cannot really return to these times, but also we don't have actually an idea how to do that, because that would imply a migration of enormous amount of people to various parts of China, resettling them, and so on. So Xuecheng was a thinker who even used the term that is the closest counterpart of the modern notion of progress in China, which is zhu, because he was writing zhu, like entering, zhu. So he was writing that the shi itself tends to expiring, but we people can use it for the zhu of certain social institution. So the progress was not placed within historical process, but within social institutions that could or not benefit from the development and recognition of this impersonal tendency. So this is a point that we still have linear views there. Of course, most of them view this line as divided, mediated by various cycles, stages, and so on. But what I mean by saying linearity, maybe that was not so clear, sorry for that in the book, that it is the vector, the very vector. If we have the idea of a fall or progress, we have linearity that is inscribed there. Like we believe that from the point A to B, there is a fall. So we can make this arrow the line of a fall or of a progress. In purely cyclical concepts, you cannot have that. So Chinese are famous, and I think that it is all the more clear after my exposition of their reflection of thinking of history in the macro scale. So what I want to say is that many of them thought of history in macro scale as a line, and they viewed cycles only as stages, or let's say low order mechanisms within this macro structure of history. The question about the modern reinterpretations of Tianming, I don't feel as an expert in that topic. In fact, I'm now working on the Chinese philosophy of history in 19th and 20th century, and I'm sitting a little bit in the 60s of the 19th century in the self-strengthening movement with some forays into Mao and Li Dazhao, but I still have not researched that thoroughly. So as I know, there are thinkers that try to revive that. I think of Jiang Qing as an example, most of all. I know that he's somehow deemed a weird thinker, but this is a reinterpretation nonetheless, right? He's one of the thinkers, contemporary thinkers, that does it quite explicitly. There are some interesting points in paradoxically two-way meaning regard the role of Tian and generally viewing Tian as some sort of a guarantee of political order, which could be seen as the essence of the idea of Tianming, not necessarily its direct content. So the question, of course, arises, especially following this mode of thinking that was expressed by Zhang Zhidong, that we have Zhongti Xiyong, whether we are looking for some sort of followers of the direct content of this theory, or rather the idea of transcendent legitimacy of political power in general and its presence in history, in contemporary Chinese reflection. The second being the case, I think that we will find many new Confucian thinkers who subscribe to such a way. of thinking. And Zhang, Qin, Tu Weiming, I don't think that we have so much of them, but once again, I will work on them maybe next year, if heaven helps me so. So I think that at that time I'll be more competent to answer this question. Sorry, I'm very sorry that I cannot do this by now.
So thank you very much for this information you have given. I think it was quite inspiring, and I will now wait, very excited for this. For you to arrive at the 21st century. You are now at the 20th century already, so this is good. And I would just like to add that Zhang Qing is really a kind of weird scholar, while Zhao Dingyang is not. In my opinion, he is really a good theoretician who has to be taken seriously also. Yes. So I'm waiting. Thank you, David.
Thank you, David. And yes, thinking about cycles and macro cycles in particular, of course, I think about the Buddhist view of time and that kind of interpretation of history. And I'm pretty sure that, as anticipated, Chiara Ghidini will have something to ask about that, about the absence of Buddhism from your survey.
Yeah, well, first of all, I just to say that what you were talking about before always called to my mind a couple of works by Prasenjit Dwara.
Yes.
One in particular is Why is History Anti-Theoretical? Which was basically written because he wanted to, to start from the viewpoint of somebody who is interested in the question, he says, of how historiographical paradigms shape our understanding of China and why history is anti-theoretical. So there is a whole discussion about linearity and about the relationship between linearity and nation building. So the modern perspective, related to history. And also, I think what he did on circulatory history and competitive histories and the idea of multiple temporalities,
yes,
which occur in pre-modern times as well as in our own time. So I guess that Dwara could be interesting. Also something that he edited on the actually history of science, which takes into consideration the holism and the fact that in China this was holistic and dialectical at the same time, which I think could be somehow useful, but perhaps it's because I'm more familiar with Dwara because he always gets angry with Hayden White, and it's interesting, it's fascinating, and the way this works. Now, yes, so you knew that I would come with a question because in your book you state why you actually don't talk about, don't go into the 19th century somehow to avoid the impact of Western epistemologies, and I understand that. But then what I really would like you to just say to us is why you chose to, I would say, avoid Buddhism, because, well, apart from Zhang Xuecheng, who, even in the translations edited by Ivanhoe, Buddhism actually plays quite a part, but even in pre-modern times, because there is one discussion you make about originality. Now, I guess that I would like to know what you really intend for originality, and why you think that Buddhist epistemology is somehow foreign. We have here one person who's actually working with a translation of sutras, and planning to say, and actually said, that, for example, Buddhacharita in Chinese is probably a Chinese work. Yes. And I guess there are lots of Chinese sutra which are actually Chinese. So, how do you, so why not Buddhism?
Yeah. So avoiding is a nice term. Exclusion is not so nice. I would say that what led me to this decision was the fact that in terms of the philosophy of history, I really couldn't have found a thinker, I mean a Buddhist thinker, that would develop a philosophy of, let's say, human history, or incorporated the philosophical theory of human history into his or her philosophy of the history of the universe. So that was my main motive. And then I, of course, stood in front of the dilemma whether or not devote, let's say, hundreds of hours in order to explore the Buddhist canon, looking for, 2 or 3 sentences. And I've done that with regard to Confucian canon, and I was done. I had a look at the Buddhist scholars, at Chinese scholars of Buddhist philosophy, and I really still couldn't have found there. I'm not saying that Buddhism did not have any influence upon, say, Chinese historiography. It had, but as I mentioned, criticism of Buddhism had an even greater impact. And there were many eclectic ideas from the very beginning, like that Buddhist devotion helps the emperor to receive heaven's support. And that did not find, let's say, a common widespread espousal. So it also reduces Buddhism to a tool of achieving a Confucian defined goal, right? So this is the basic problem, and of course the subsequent dilemma. As for epistemology, I don't recall I mentioned that it was totally alien to Chinese. In fact, I tend to believe that in terms of precisely Buddhist epistemology, this is a place we should look for an implicit Buddhist roots of many Neo-Confucian views of history. And I stress that from time to time, especially with regard to Shaoyong. So Shaoyong is the most Buddhist among Confucian philosophers of history in China. Not only because he sees history as a succession of universes, which is a very Buddhist idea, and Chan Wing-Cit criticized Shaoyong. He wrote that this is Chan's work from his famous source book in Chinese philosophy about Shaoyong's scheme of history. The whole scheme is as arbitrary as it is superficial. The idea that one word succeeds another is evidently Buddhist influenced. So this is an ultimate offense. And I don't consider that an offense, but I agree that this is a Buddhist influenced idea. And Confucians did not have, let's say, so much imagination before Buddhism coming to China as of thinking of words. Not to say that the very term for word that we use nowadays, shijie and sekai, is very specifically Buddhist, because it connects with the concept of generation and the concept of a circle. So this is a circle that is outlined by people living in the same generation. But we can live in other worlds after our death, and there are other universes with other devas. So this more recalls me, let's say, late Vasubandhu, or generally Yogacara eschatology, than anything that I can find in China. So this is important issue, that we have a different notion of time, of world there. And I really decided we have to exclude something, after all, that would entail also an engagement with purely Indian categories, and this somehow draws me from the main purpose of the book, which was already huge at that time, which is a reconstruction of the Chinese philosophy of history. So this is my exclusion. But Shaoyong also, he, in terms of epistemology, as you mentioned, he used the concept of non-dual knowledge, the concept of no self, wu wo. So when he criticizes, as I write, that we cannot really grasp history from subjective perspective, he means that somehow we should, he's not writing that there is no subject as Buddhists would do, but that we should grasp the entire universe as such things in the world from non-subjective perspective. And his words that the present is called the present when it is seen from the perspective of the present, but from the perspective of the past, it is the future of the people that lived in the past. Like we are Caesar's future, right? But Caesar is our past. This is like total repertoire of the critique of Zheng Zhao, that is in his Zhao Ruan treatise on the cause, as we might translate it, generally Madhyamaka criticism of time. And this is incorporated into the writings of Shaoyong. And Jushi and other thinkers also criticized him for being a little bit crypto-Buddhist. The same goes for Wang Ganshi, who was also inspired by Buddhism and its ideas of, let's say, the idea of transcendence or Buddhist escapism, maybe even, because he believed that these sages are only spirits acting in the world, but generally their cognition somehow exceeds the limits of human body, and he used the word Shen in a very non-specific way to the Chinese. Li Zhi, who became at the end of his life a Buddhist, as I recall, also referred to these ideas. I would say that Wang Yangmin too, because Wang Yangmin, in his very relict philosophy of history, he wrote that we can really grasp the entirety of history if we only have an insight into our own nature, because since our nature is identical with the principle, and this principle, he agreed with Jushi, is somehow governing history, we can really, as he wrote, come back to the times of Yao and Shun in our minds after purifying our mind heart. So I would also say that this is a very Buddhist influenced idea. Of course, we know that there is a lot of such ideas in Wang Yangmin, and the very idea of Buddhist meditation and so on. I will not touch upon that. But I would say that even the idea of the principle of history, the very term Li, the Chinese intellectuals are, especially those of Confucian provenance, are terrified of pointing out to them that this comes from Fuzhi, that this comes from the Huayan metaphysics, the very distinction into Li and Shi. And then we have the Li, which is the principle of history, and Shi not so much as phenomena, but as events in the classical sense of this term, like matters. And we have this dualism in the Cheng brothers and Jushi in their philosophy of history that are terrified. It turns out that the Neo-Confucian idealist philosophy of history was Buddhist. And this is really they are scared because most of them are somehow devoted their lifetime activity to investigating Jushi and so on. So they don't want to hear that. I would say that we have really strong influences of Buddhism, but nonetheless, I would say provocatively that the first Buddhist philosopher of history in China was Zhang Taiyan.
Yeah, well, I mean, I'm thinking of Kyoto School.
Yeah,
and they mixed everything very. I mean, they were not scared.
Definitely.
I would say that with this extensive answer, David has really made justice to Buddhism. It is absent in the book, but it was very well present in our debate, right? And we have a question from one of our guests. Please, Robert Hall.
I'm on Robert Hall's account, who's my husband. He's also a student.
Yes.
So, hello, everybody.
Oh, hi.
Hi. I was, firstly, this is amazing. It sounds like a wonderful book. Secondly, I'm interested to know what you think about, so I realize and sort of very much by what you were saying about the need to think about the diversity of views in Chinese thinking, and obviously not just collapse it into one, even though as was mentioned, there is that trend towards unifying or giving a unified view of whatever the Chinese view of something might be. However, like I think you probably would still accept that there are dominant or less dominant trends, and so we can think about the dominant or less dominant trend. So in that context, I'm wondering if you think there is or in your exploration, how much you discovered in terms of discussions of the relationship between historicity or history and time, and thinking about time maybe in the more as a more abstract notion, and whether that even exists in Chinese philosophy, essentially that notion of time absent history. Because in some senses, I feel like there's a sort of stereotypical view of Chinese thinking that might want to say there is that Chinese philosophy tends to be ahistorical because there's less discussion of history in Chinese philosophy than perhaps in, for example, European. that's just the stereotype, which, as you very clearly outlined, and I very much buy into, is obviously wrong. But I wonder what you think about that related issue of the relationship between temporality and historicity, and whether there is an important distinction to be made there, and how it's picked up in various thinkers. So yeah, just really your thoughts about that, on that area.
Okay.
Yeah.
So regarding the first remark of yours, Sarah, before the question, is I see two dominant currents of the philosophy of history in China. So as a person that was somehow, I come from Poland, when actually history of ideas is stronger than history of philosophy. I mean Leszek Kołakowski, Andrzej Walicki, and so on. So I always try to find some grand durée currents of thought. And I would say that in terms of China, the one is the current that saw the unfolding of Tao in history, that is conducive to historical idealism, and the other are the theorists of Shi, of this historical tendency. And I try to prove that based on this diachronical summary of respective schools and approaches. Your question, I would say that this is really a separate topic. I really also did not want to touch upon the concept of time. I mentioned the Book of Changes from the perspective of the philosophy of history, but as I wrote there, the most important thing in the Book of Changes is rather the philosophy of time, and the philosophy of history is developed in some of the commentaries, mostly Xuecheng, to the Book of Changes, and especially in the Yin-Yang school, but not so much in the Book of Changes, which still happens to be one of the most important philosophical works, and definitely one of the most influential ones in Chinese tradition. So I'd say that definitely we have to look for that. I know that Professor Jilu Liu was working on a book of the concepts of time in China. I don't know whether she is still working on that project, but maybe there will be some book on that topic too. What I can say is that for now is that before Buddhism, again, Buddhism coming to China, we didn't really have, I think, in China at least a clear abstract concept of time. Not to say that the term shi, that is now used, or this Japanese ji for time, was mostly used as a term for season. Like we have 4 seasons, but or we have a proper time in the sense of Greek kairos. This was used especially by Sun Tzu in the Art of War. So we have to seize the shi. Or Wang Chung also mentioned shi as one of the main contingent factors that determine history, the proper time. But the proper time is a political time. The shi is a natural time. The question is whether we have a time at all. A background time in its metaphysical sense in the Warring States period or Han period philosophy. I would really doubt that, but since we have Buddhism in China, then time comes to the fore as one of the main topics of debates. And it's not a coincidence that Zheng Zhao and all the Madhyamaka thinkers, which are one of the most subtle thinkers in this time at all, I think, what was going on in Europe at that time, reflected upon the category of time.
Thanks, that's really helpful. I think it's really useful as an additional element of the picture of the differentiation from Western thinking, actually, or that period of you've been referring to in terms of the focus on philosophy of history. Thank you.
Antonio De Caro, University of Brno, has a question, right? Or an observation.
Hello, yes, thank you very much, and congratulations. So my question is rather limited to asking you precisely if you think that there is a indigenous Chinese Christian view of history, because you already mentioned, for example, Li Zhuzhao, and I would like to know, for example, if the influence of Jesuit missionaries like Joseph de la Prémarée, the figurist, would try to challenge the idea of Zhuxi, that in the Taiji Tushuo we have Wuji or Taiji. So as you know, Zhuxi interpret this as a sort of unification of the two principles, whereas Prémarée started to say, no, there is a consequentiality. Therefore, we should translate this term as then. And so we have Wuji are Taiji, and so we have the Wuji, and then we have the Taiji. And somehow from this, he developed this idea that monotheism was already somehow part of the Chinese tradition. So I would like to know if you saw in your studies some influences of this point of view, and if you would like to say more about the Christian vision and the influence on the Chinese philosophical thought. Thank you.
That's a very hard question. As I tend to believe for now, I can see a clear inspirations on the Chinese philosophy of history in the case of Zhuang Cunyu from the Zhangzhou school of Confucianism, but this is at the turn of the 18th and 19th century. It was, I guess, he was inspired by the writings of the Jesuit Diego de Pantoja or something like that. And we have a notion of creation there. So I would say that with this idea, we can really say that we see something really new. I don't know whether we can fully subscribe this term you mentioned to the influence of Christianity, because we have so many terms in the Song metaphysics at the time. And Zhou Duni is perceived even by some Chinese scholars as a Taoist thinker. So I would say that we need to have a more complicated image of these terms. I'm not really convinced fully that what you said could be fully explained merely by reference to some influence of Christianity, but they cannot be excluded, of course. About Li Zhizhao was not a philosopher of history, and probably none of these early Chinese neophytes was. But in terms of a general historical thinking, because I did not mention, philosophy of history and historiosophy are parts of historical thinking generally, the way we think of history. So this is the most general concept I operate with. And in terms of historical thinking, Li Zhizhao, in his introduction to Minlit Han, he equated various chronologies. So he equated the chronology of this branches, and not that classical chronology of how's that called, branches and yeah, Jana, I cannot hear you.
I think roots.
Yeah, roots simply. Yeah, roots. Okay, I looked for an English term, so it was an easy one. Branches and roots, and he equated, or rather compared, put at the same scale with dynastic one. So the year of, let's say, some Zhou ruler. The third one was the Christian one, the years that have passed since the birth, or he said Zhang. So the not the birth, but yeah. The fact that Jesus was incarnated, and the fourth one was he invented by himself, which is the year that have passed since the death of Confucius. So while introducing Aristotle, he's writing that Aristotle was born, and then we have these years after Christ, after Confucius, in the, let's say, 12th year of the reign of the king Huan of Zhou, whatever, and in, let's say, the year of a wooden pig. So in this sense, Li Zhizhao, we may say that, or in terms of historiosophy even, came up with an idea of a universal history, and clearly saw these cycles are referring to the same historical reality that could be otherwise narrated in purely linear terms. And also what he did there is to place Jesus and Confucius as both, as some sort of transcendent landmarks in the history of humankind. So this is very interesting. But there are no Christian native pre-modern Chinese philosophers of history. Where the person that came to my mind almost automatically with your question is a very modern figure I'd like to investigate, namely Bishop Stanislas Wang from Taiwan.
Yes.
He wrote a book which has, I guess, 600 pages, and its title is 历史哲学. And he has another work in comparative Western and Chinese philosophy of history too. And from what I have already read, he tends to believe history as the domain of the activity of heaven, but he does not subscribe to a fully providential overview, namely that God somehow intervenes in history, but that God inscribed the desire for happiness into people's shin. So by means of going towards achieving this goal, we are reconstructing God's plan. That is basically his philosophy of history. And we may say that this is a Christian Chinese philosophy of history created by a Taiwanese bishop with a Polish name. But I don't see prominent thinkers of such a narrow provenance before, at least for now. And I say prominent, like really huge figures that have developed some original, unprecedented view of history.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Federico, I think that I don't know what's your plan, but
yes, I think we
are at time. We can either conclude or yes. I think that you planned some other questions and questions.
No, but I had planned other questions, but they were just emergency questions in case people wouldn't ask anything. So yes, my only final it is not intended to be a question because we don't have time to start a discussion, but it's something I thought about reading your book, and we also partially discussed it together. There is another cliche, I would say, about Chinese views on history, which is a sort of elitism, right, in terms of agency. Generally, we see that the protagonists of historical change or historical important passages or actions are prominent individuals, sages, kings, etc. This is also a critique that was directed towards Chinese historiography. If we think about Etienne Balage, right, saying that Chinese historiography is something written by officials for officials, and more generally. But I would say that differently, this is at least my opinion, and I would just like to have your quick opinion on this. Differently from the issue of time, which is indeed a cliche, because if we look in detail, as you did, we see that this cyclical nature of history is indeed marginal, actually. But I think that the views of history in which the people really play an important role are actually marginal in Chinese philosophy of history. And even if they do so, they are more like instruments of something else rather than agents with a specific will of action or with at least an understanding of what they are doing. Even the theory of Minben by Mencius considers the people as a natural force. So it basically warns, right, the ruler from the potential disaster of people not being not supporting, but people are compared to water, right? That surrects the boat, but they can overturn it. But this does not entail some kind of voluntary activity or participation in the historical change. There are some thinkers like Diai that you mentioned that give some kind of role to the people. I would like just to know, in general terms, if you think that this can be considered as something actually changing after the impact with Western theories. So a bigger stress on the role of people in making history.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
What's your opinion on this?
Thank you. Huge team. I would say that the West cannot decide what type of stereotype to have, whether Chinese history was an example of merely individuals having an influence on the course of things, or whether China is a perfect example of collectivism and the fact that the masses are important and that we have these peasant rebellions and the individual mean nothing. So the Westerners cannot really decide, and this already shows that there is something more complicated going on. Jiai, of course, is an instance of a thinker I'd like to label as historical populist, and by doing that, I try to recover the term populism also. not only as a term, a category that refers to demagogy and all the phenomena that we are now witnessing in the world, but in the frontal sense of this term, that populism is an ideology that recognizes the people as the main political force or historical force. Of course, it tends to understand people, to conceive them in a very specific manner as a homogeneous body. Usually what they have in mind is the common people, especially the rural population, the folks, right? And this is also the case of Jiai, but Jiai writes that, well, the people constitute the root, and if the victory was won, it is because the people won so. And he ends this huge passage, I quote there, with a words that could be really written by Mao or any other Chinese communists. Oh, be warned, in any opposition to the people will win. So these are the words of Jiai, who witnessed the fall of the Qin dynasty due to the rebellion initiated by a peasant Chen She, and there was a dynasty founded by a peasant Liu Bang. So Jiai was a clever guy, and he said, come on, we see, the people matter. But on the other hand, I agree, Federico, tended to understand people in a very instrumental way, because he said that people cannot do anything except agriculture, that all the more they should not do anything connected with trade. They cannot deal with money because they are stupid, they are idiots. That would lead to inflation, he said. So the people are designed in a very specific way. They should behave that and not the other way around. They are compared to the floor. There is a chapter in Jiai's Xinshu which has a very peculiar title, Jieji, the same term that contemporarily means class, and that was used by Chinese Marxists to denote classes, and it means stairs and steps. And this is a title for the chapter where Jiai compares people to the floor. We can walk on them. They are the basis, but because they are unified and we can walk on them. Then we have a stairs, which are officials, and the throne, which is the ruler. So this is very intriguing, that the Marxist notion of a class, or Marxism fighting, right, emancipation and so on, comes from this populist source. And this is also populist in the common sense of this term. But I would say that we cannot be too anachronistic. And at that time, such an acknowledgement that Zheng means the care for the people, and that ruler has to take care of the people by any means, because this is, of course, in his own interest, but from a moral viewpoint, which Jiai represented in his essay on the faults of the Qin, this is a moral value per se. And I think that it was also for Mencius. If we have this Buzhen Zhenjixin, we have to take care of the people. It is not only the case of our, clever way of behaving, realpolitik, and so on. It is an additional argument, I would say, that came there. And the context is that Jiai is somehow trying to persuade the Han rulers to accept Confucianism as the basis of their rule. So we should also be aware of that context, of that background. Well, in the later development of the Chinese philosophy of history, I would say that we have as much individualist approaches as it would be good to say collectivist one. And holism regarding causality, I think that it would be the best to understand holistic approaches to the issue of agency, historical agency, as those approaches that somehow synthesize, unify both standpoints. For instance, already in this Tianming approach, we see that there is a clear struggle for finding some sort of continuous transition from the influence individual has upon history to the role of, let's say, human collective social groups. And in this sense, such a holism was a really characteristic feature of Confucian approach to history, which is aware that a ruler is a ruler not due to his personal qualities, like psychological ones and so on, but because he acts as a ruler. It is his function that matters. And his function is to represent and to take care of the people, at least if we stick to this traditional Mencian formulation. So in the field of the philosophy of history, it meant even for such thinkers as Wang Fuzhi that we have to acknowledge both the role of impersonal tendencies, this shi of history, that is manifested in particular events and the individuals, prominent individuals. But individuals are not prominent because they are good looking or clever. And you can see that already in the Book of Documents. We don't have a concept of heroes like in Greek mythology. Sages are not equipped with some, extra force. They don't have a talent for foretelling the future like Jewish prophets. They are the exceptional people are exceptional in terms of their morality. So this is these high requirements that all the ruler in the Confucian reading has to fulfill. And in terms of realistic version of Confucianism as represented by Wang Fuzhi, prominency means that individuals are capable of, as he wrote, listening to the voice of history. This is very important, not seeing, not Platonic metaphor of the sight, but the hear, like in the Jewish Old Testament. We hear that, like someone's running. It is very subtle. It is a developing tendency. It could be barely observed. So listening to the voice of history and reacting properly before other people. So there is no cause and effect relation there. It is not the case that we have some sort of manual science of history or logic of history, and we can say what will happen in the future. Wang Fuzhi does not presuppose any vision of determined future, but he's very stubborn by saying that there is a necessary linear unfolding tendency of history. So these are prominent individuals. I would say once again, to a little bit contextualize that, if Wang Fuzhi was born today, he would say, come on, have a look at Ukraine. So we see that there was a tendency of history there at Ukraine. So when the Yanukovych was re-elected, we all saw that Ukraine somehow gravitates more towards Russia and so on. So if people at that time realized that something bad is going on, they would just, quit and leave Ukraine and so on. But there were people who feel there is nothing going on. But then we have oligarchs who are more and more powerful. All of them are associated with Russia. And then we have these green soldiers and invasion, annexion of Crimea. And this is a point about which Wang Fuzhi said with regard to Chinese history, such as the Tang dynasty and its fall, the Sung dynasty and its fall, that there is some sort of threshold after which it is too late to revert the necessary trend of things. But we can postpone it. We can prevent the tragedy, as for instance, General Guozi did in the Tang dynasty by postponing the fall of the dynasty. But as he wrote, already hiring the foreign mercenaries, these armies consisting of non-Chinese people, initiated the bad tendency, the tendency of the fall of the Tang dynasty. But it could have been prevented very early, and there will be no tragedy. So individuals are these people. So if you, for instance, lived in Ukraine at that time and Yanukovych was re-elected, and you would go to Poland or to Germany saying there will be a war in Ukraine, people will tell you, you're mad. You're mad. Are you a prophet? You'll say, I'm not a prophet. I'm Wang Fuzhi, like philosopher of history who clearly sees the unfolding tendency of history. And that would be it. That would make you a prominent individual. So they in this sense, this also connects with this topic of irrationality. They may look like mad people, but they are not. And this testifies to the fact that throughout the Chinese tradition, the prominent individuals are usually understood as those that are capable of thinking of history and politics in the macro scale, that do not stick to the matters of time, that do not think of their current private interest. They think of they think from the viewpoint of the grand scheme of things. And in this sense, we can have prominent individuals which are the sages, but also the rulers. The ruler could be an idiot. He doesn't have to be a sage, but he could be a prominent individual that has a great impact upon historical process nonetheless. The same concerns Confucius, who was not a king. He was the sage, but if we preserve the term Shenzhen for the creators of Chinese civilization, as some Chinese thinkers did, we have then many prominent thinkers that are neither sages nor rulers, but they could be also prominent individuals if they have an efficient effect, influence upon the people, and for instance convince them to prevent some events like Chenliang, appealed to the Chinese to prevent the barbarians from the north, to unify the Chinese nation once again, and so on. So in this sense, he also is a prominent individual. So prominent individuals are prominent due to impersonal mechanisms, and this makes this holistic concepts work in terms of avoiding both Scylla of individualism and Charybdis of collectivism.
Okay. Well, I think some of our students might feel overwhelmed at the end of this survey, magnificent survey of so many characters, right, and events. But I'm sure that they will have a lot of food for thought, especially since some of them are in their process of preparing their exam of Chinese history. So I think this has been a very useful way for them to get even more scared, I think, before the exam, because they will realize that there is so much to know and to understand. But yes, so I found it fascinating that we could connect all these reflections from imperial or pre-imperial thinkers to our current era and to our dynamics. And really, I mean, the problems are always the same, the questions are always the same, and the fact that the majority of people cannot listen to history, and even those who can often lack the following passage, which is the will to act, which is another point, because you can understand history, but then you have to act. You have to decide whether you want to act or not, and that's another key passage. But we don't have time also to address this other philosophical issue. I hope maybe in the future we will have some kind of discussion on this aspect, on the aspect of will and freedom of action, agency, maybe in a comparative perspective. That would be something fascinating, also connected to what we have said today. So once again, thank you very much, Dawid Rogacz, first of all, for presenting his book, and thank to all our guests, to Chiara Ghidini and Donatella Guida, who introduced the event, and Jana Roschker, Antonio De Caro, and I see many other friends and colleagues from around the world that joined us, and hope to see you soon for some event, probably. We do not anticipate anything, but we are preparing something else with some of the people who are here. Thank you very much, and have a nice day, everybody.
Thank you.
Bye.
Thank you very much.
Bye-bye.
Greetings from Poland.
Bye. Bye-bye. Thank you. Bye. Bye-bye.
Federico, may I leave?
Yes, of course. I was trying to understand if I have the just a second.
Okay.